thank Catherine and Bob and Agnes for those presentations. We're now going to take some questions. What I propose to do is we take a group of questions, 3 or 4. When you want to give a question, if you wouldn't mind standing up and introducing yourself, that would be great. So we'll just open it up. Okay. Gabo? Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. Particularly, I got interest in your view about multiple events, negative events. Agnes talked about the combination of dowry and illness. How about Ethiopia? I know Ethiopia doesn't have dowry, but has very expensive funeral expenses. Is there any combinations of funerals and illness? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deborah Browdigam. I'm also from DSG, like Shawa. Thank you for that. It was a really interesting set of presentations. One of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to you was, I know that you're not focused on growth, but one of the key things historically that has reduced poverty is employment, people getting jobs, and particularly, again, historically in the United States, we have very few people living in the rural areas, and so they have migrated out. So there's been out-migration, and then there have been remittances and so on to those that have remained behind. And I remember being at a conference in Beijing last year, the year before, in which a Chinese economist said, you know how we're reducing poverty in the rural areas is we're bringing people into the cities, and that's how we're going to do it. So I wonder about that, about remittances and also out-migration and employment opportunities, and whether or not you captured that in your data, and if so, what that shows. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Tom Herlihy. I'm from Land O'Lakes. This was a very interesting panel, and I really appreciated some of the observations. 2 questions, though. Catherine, in your presentation, you said some things that were different than what was written up there. It seems there's a little bit of a contradiction in that people who had a high dependence on agricultural incomes had less vulnerability to falling in, but then the rainfall affected them. So I'd like you to explore that. In particular, I'd like to hear if you actually looked at what happened to farmers who may have had livestock, dairy cows, beef, poultry, and other things, because that's clearly an asset throughout the developing world, and it can help prevent people from falling into poverty. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marie Ruel from the Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division. I was surprised, given the results that were presented on your last slide, Bob, that you didn't mention the importance of addressing nutrition and health as a priority for helping people move out of poverty.
I think the question that's relevant to me is the question you posed about employment and migration, which I think is common across many countries. It's actually been quite important in Bangladesh, and you do have a large part of the population, especially girls, who have moved to garment factories in Dhaka, and that has actually changed the dynamic around education and dowries a lot, as well as men mostly who've gone to the Middle East and other countries and who are sending in remittances. Not in this particular paper, but in another paper where we look at the role of positive shocks on asset accumulation, we do find that remittances from non-resident household members are very important in building up the asset stock. And then I also have some work with Valerie Mueller from your division, which looks at the role of migration in labor markets in mitigating shocks as a result of weather. So yeah, it's quite important.
To answer Marie's question, I mean, obviously, nutrition and health are, particularly in the early childhood years, are incredibly important in terms of interrupting the intergenerational transmission of poverty. I think the reason why this isn't in this particular presentation is that the CPRC had its own theme on the intergenerational transmission of poverty, and there were a number of papers which were commissioned by well-known people such as Joe Berman, for example, looking at exactly those issues.
Thanks for the comments. Funerals and an illness. Yeah, we found more that it was the combination of agricultural shocks and illness in our case that drove people into poverty. Quite a large majority of the people in our villages belong to Ethiopian funeral societies. These kind of informal societies, which are very strong in the rural areas, and both from Quant and Qual work, we found that those are actually quite effective in helping people to manage with funeral expenses, I think. I mean, I wouldn't rule out completely the idea of funeral expense contributing to chronic poverty, but I think overall it does seem to be a very strong informal mechanism that people use to cope with that kind of shock. In terms of migration, in our sample there is actually very little migration, at least during that period. I do believe that internal migration is now increasing a lot more, but during that period there was quite restrictive sort of land rights, where if you leave your home village then you might not get to come back and have the right to farm on it again, so that had sort of contributed to reduced migration, and so we didn't find any sort of significant impact of remittances in terms of reducing this vulnerability. In some other work that I've done, I have looked at this idea of the sort of the diversification and the farm and the non-farm employment and income, and I have found that people do try to find non-farm income, sort of which is labour or setting up your own business. I found a lot of women sort of going and collecting either dung or firewood and then taking it to a local market and selling it. And those kinds of activities are they're actually quite high energy activities, so people might consume more, but I don't think that it always has a net sort of positive impact on their nutrition or on their BMI at that point. But yeah, I mean, it was just a puzzling sort of result in the regression. We found a lot of significant effects of weather, but overall, the people who sort of started with a higher agricultural share of their income seemed to do better. And I think I explained that by the fact that they had more land and they had more livestock as well. And I haven't looked quite so much into the sort of the other smaller animals like the poultry, but I would like to look at that actually as something which I think a lot of people are using those sorts of things as a mechanism to sort of diversify their well-being. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, just to say a little bit about the migration and remittance aspects in the other 4 studies in the book, which were Nepal, Pakistan, South Africa, and Vietnam. All the household surveys did pick up remittances as part of the modules on income. They picked up a certain amount on migration, but it very much depended on the questions which were asked on tracking. In the South Africa study, migration, particularly by single people in search of jobs, and then return migration, when people have lost those wage jobs, were very important drivers of movements in and out of poverty. In the Vietnamese study, which I mentioned earlier, there are restrictions imposed by the government, a household registration scheme, which actually is principally aimed at preventing migration from rural areas to the cities, and that was clearly having a very bad impact on people who lived in remote areas. crucially ethnic minorities who found it very difficult to gain access to wage employment.
Hello, my name is Sarah Gavian. I'm from the International Fertilizer Development Center. And I have a comment first to Catherine on the results you flew by, but that the cultivation of cash crops can help reduce poverty. Certainly in the U.S. context right now with Feed the Future, which is very focused on food crops, that becomes an important conclusion. And I think most of us have seen it in other lines of work, and things that pull that out certainly help get a more nuanced set of interventions going under Feed the Future type thinking. The second question, that's a comment. The other is a question. When in doing your studies, I hear regression. There wasn't much talk of method, so I do hear there's regressions behind this. Did you take a systems approach anywhere, or only a household approach? And I ask that in the context of the dowry questions, because some of these events will hit a household and they destroy income. Some are redistributed income, and I'm specifically speaking of the dowry where you accumulate and hand it to someone. So in theory, someone's richer if someone's poorer. How does that play itself out? Does it all get consumed in kind of non-useful interventions, or have you got that at least on the coming into households, how that could help? I do want to go back to Mary Ruel's question, and specifically or a version of it as to whether child undernutrition predicts poverty, because we always hear that the terrible malnutrition of the 1984 famine, for example, in Ethiopia, can leave people less able in subsequent life to deal with life's vagaries. So maybe, I didn't know if there's any research coming out on what those cumulative effects would be. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Brian Greenberg, and I'm with Interaction. Wanted to thank you for those presentations and see if I could get the panel to react to a couple of the takeaways that I have. And one is that if shocks help to explain part of the dynamic of moving into poverty, is there a problem in that shocks are, if you will, an experiential category? They're not an objective explanation. If one is extremely vulnerable and poor, something which is relatively minor to a more advantaged family is going to be a shock. And therefore there's, if you will, a tautological loop between what counts as a shock and the role it serves in explaining how people get into poverty when they're typically already poor, if those things contribute to shocks. And so related to that, I guess, is the sense that if asset building is critical, excuse me a second, let me just provide a little bit more background. If there are hazards and risks that people face, and there is a background rate, if you will, of people moving into poverty and people moving out of poverty, and of course you hope to get one of those flows bigger than the other, then asset building becomes critical to changing those flows and to building protections against shocks. So the question then becomes, in a predominantly rural agricultural economy, how to do that. And I wonder if you have primary suggestions about how to do the asset building, which seems to be primarily protective. And not only the asset building, but then it would need to build resilience to reduce the vulnerability that the assets of the poor have to being degraded by shocks. So it's the asset building plus resilience which really seem substantively the way out of this. Thanks.
Hello, thank you all for your presentations. My name is Colleen Rozier and I work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I'm about to knock over all of my food. But thank you again, and my question is about how you're measuring poverty. Catherine, you talked about it being a measure of consumption. So I'm kind of curious about how that happens, and wondering how, I mean, I lived with some folks in Uganda for a time who were very self-sufficient, agricultural community, content, happy, but they probably would not be functioning very highly on a cash economy, and a lot of their food they would be providing for themselves. So I was wondering if you kind of broke down when you're saying that the 2,000 calories a day, whether if they provided that for themselves, would that be counted into the number that they were consuming or not? Just kind of curious about that. And then also, Bob, you had mentioned an absolute measure of poverty, and that it would be possible to kind of move everyone above a kind of an absolute base that's kind of, quality of life. And my question about that is, as that's kind of also a consumption focus, if we are incentivizing more and more consumption, what's the impact kind of on natural resource base? And I was wondering whether at the same time, whether there was anyone you were working with or anyone doing similar studies on environmental indicators in addition to the economic and social ones that you guys were looking at. So those are my two questions. I don't know how articulate I've been, but thank you again.
Thank you. Catherine Feeney with the World Food Programme. Agnes, I was fascinated with your summary of the interviews with the households, and floods or acute shocks were not identified as one of the key concerns on their part, and you opined that perhaps this is due to the emergency response, which I assume may have been effective. I'm just wondering, did that come through at all in the case of Ethiopia as well, where you mentioned agriculture being identified as a concern, but just wondering if it was the shock side as well? And also, Bob, in terms of the policy implications, you mentioned the conditional cash transfers, cash for work, etc. In situations where markets are not functioning, I'm wondering if you would see a role for other types of interventions, such as food for work. Thank you.
I'm not going to answer all of this, but I wanted to address some of the ones that I can address. So the issue about the idea that the emphasis on cash crops as poverty reducing, sort of going against the feed the future thinking, I think shows, I wouldn't exactly agree with that. I think we're looking at cash crops here as a way of income diversification. And also, a food crop is potentially a cash crop once you produce a marketable surplus that you can sell on the market. So I think some of these old dichotomies between food crops and cash crops are actually going to erode once you move out of subsistence production. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of discussion about the ill effects of commercialization, but I think we should be moving towards a frame of mind where we're looking at diversification of income sources, which can help protect you better against risk. Regarding the question about dowries, we actually did include a question about dowry receipts. So it's, you pay out, you pay a dowry. You can also receive a dowry when your son gets married. But I think the issue about dowry is not so much the issue of having to shell out this huge amount of money. It's whether you're actually able. There are a number of issues. One is whether you're actually able to save to pay out this dowry without having to reduce consumption in areas which are very important to you. And the other issue in the context of South Asia is how this dowry is being controlled, because there are all these studies which show the correlation between dowries and domestic violence. So dowry is a very loaded issue. It's not just a monetary transfer. It is true that shocks are an experiential category, and one must be careful of reporting biases for shocks. We deal with that in the econometrics by sometimes using village reports for some, for example, the aggregate shocks, like were you affected by a flood? So for example, if you're richer, you might say, yes, I was affected more by the flood because it killed more of my livestock. So we use average of community reports to take care of this type of reporting bias. I like your point about building assets so as to build resilience to shocks. I think one of the issues in a lot of these economies is that you don't really have instruments for saving. You should be able to protect your assets against shocks, negative shocks, but when you have a windfall, you'd also find a way of building up those your savings or those assets in a way that you can actually build them up and not just sort of hide them under your mattress or something like that. So I'm going to stop here.
To pick up on two of those points, on Madaris, for life history work, which was done by our colleague Peter Davis from the University of Bath, asked households who had received dowries how they had actually used them, and then traced very, very detailed what we call life trajectory diagrams of what actually happened to those households afterwards. And what was interesting about those was they were not often seen as this great injection of cash, into the household economy, which you might expect. They very rarely came up as being important drivers of upward trajectories. On the question about perceptions of shocks and to the extent to which they're an experiential category, obviously using village reports is useful, but I'm not entirely sure that it's always the case that poor people will perceive small shocks more seriously than richer people. I mean, a good example is, for example, reporting of health shocks. With health shocks, the poorest people actually very often underreport health illnesses, okay, and that's because they have to keep going, they have to keep working, okay. They very often don't have the money to seek medical treatment. So there's lots of difficult perception type questions to ask, but I'm not sure the direction of the bias is completely in one direction, which is what you seem to be implying. On the questions about poverty measurement, a lady from USAID. First of all the studies in this book primarily used an expenditure-based definition of poverty. They all use national poverty lines, usually anchored on about 2,100 calories per person per day, plus a modest allowance for non-food expenditure. The expenditure measures will all include own consumption as well as cash consumption, so that most definitely is captured. And these are all absolute poverty measures, but they do differ from the kind of international yardsticks of $1, $1.25, and $2 a day, which you hear about in international circles. The question you raise about environmental and social sustainability as households get richer is obviously a very important one. I don't think we have a huge amount to say about it in the book, to be perfectly honest. I do think that a panel data approach in general is very useful for analysing these sorts of things, because you're looking about resources and asset depletion and all these things over time. But very often you will need specially designed surveys with modules which try and pick up on those issues, and for the most part we don't have those in these surveys. Finally, the question about cash for work and food for work and transfers in general. There is quite a lot of evidence that people prefer cash if they can. One of the other books which came out of the Chronic Poverty Research Centre's work is a book by Joe Hanlon, Armando Barrientos and David Hume called Just Give Money to the Poor. And it's a more popular book than this one in some ways, and no regressions in it. But what the central theme of that is that poor people really are in the best position to be able to decide how to allocate resources, and therefore giving them cash, not only by conditional cash transfers, but also by unconditional transfers. The sorts of things like basic pensions in South Africa have had enormous impacts on chronic poverty, which have spilled over from elderly people to the children they're very often in charge of looking after. Now, you obviously can have certain circumstances in which markets are behaving so poorly that that food itself may be preferred to cash, but I think those are typically going to be fairly rare.
Thanks for another round of really great questions. I've just been working on this question about what is the impact of the 1984 famine on children, and so we took children who were sort of around the age of between sort of being born and around 3 years old, and compared them with their siblings, and we used the data that we're using here, and we did actually find that sort of as an overall picture, they're about 3 centimeters shorter on average as a sort of cohort than their peers who were also growing up in, you know, not particularly great times. So we do actually find a marker of that. And then sort of as a very rough and ready thing, we looked at sort of the people that I was just talking about, sort of the height of the household head. How does that translate into sort of how well people are doing? And again, we found this sort of positive relationship between people being taller. I mean, we don't go any further than that in terms of what is the causal factor there. Is it that people are actually sort of stronger and healthier and able to produce more, or just in general? I mean, it seems to be true across developed countries as well. Sort of tall people have had better nutrition. All other things constant, you know, ethnicity and various genetic factors aside, it does seem to be the case that we can see that in the children. And I'd like to follow that up now that we've got data coming out for 2009. What happened to those people? In terms of the shock, I think, yeah, there's a perception idea, but there is also a sort of I think a real fact that, if you like, that people who have lower assets are more tipped into poverty by what you might call a minor event, just if you don't have any resources left to deal with it. I think especially if you've sold your livestock in response to one shock and then something else comes along, then you really might have ran out of things to do then, and you might end up becoming ill, and that sort of accumulates it. So I think you're absolutely right about the point of sort of the building up assets and also trying to sort of bolster resilience. I think those are really key points that we've been trying to bring out in the book. Yeah, absolutely. We used this 2,000 calories idea. Most of the people were growing their own food, and in our context, most of the people couldn't eat 2,000 calories sort of for the whole year. So they would have a hungry season, for example, where basically they're not able to produce enough food to feed the family for the whole year. So I think actually it was IFPRI that developed this idea of looking at sort of for how many months of the year can you feed your family adequately. And again, yeah, the environment's a crucial part of people's lives in the rural areas, and I think there are sort of local environmental issues, and then there are global environmental issues of land degradation, and but at least the people I think in our sample are really just at the point of really trying to end up self-sufficient or whatever in just food. So I think I'll leave it at that. Let other people talk.
I realise I forgot the point about asset building. In terms of developing strategies for promoting asset building, I think it's really important to recognise this idea how households trade up assets, starting often with agricultural activities, then moving into non-agricultural activities, wages, etc. And so while it's actually quite hard to come up with standardized patterns of how people move out of poverty. It's actually much more varied than, for example, falling into poverty. I think if you can try and capture the idea that people will want to have different types of assets while they're at different stages of this trading up, then this can be quite helpful, and you don't think of it purely as a single accumulation problem.
Hi, I'm Lien Tran. I'm an economist with the Federal Trade Commission. Not having seen the regression, but having followed some of the discussions here, I assume that the regressions have been run on panels of households. And of course, one of the advantages of doing this is that you can control for unobservable characteristics of the household, and I assume that you've done that. However, there may be other characteristics which I thought might be relevant here, and that is the educational background of the head of the households. Is that possible? This is just a hypothesis, and that is, would households with household heads who have attained higher level of education, would they have a higher probability of climbing out of poverty? I mean, it's okay, and I haven't heard that in the discussion, but it ought to be relevant here, right? Okay.
Oh, sorry. What?
Oh, okay. Okay, I have a few other things that I would like to finish here. And in addition to that, I know that in the case of Vietnam, the government has enforced or have passed various laws related to land users' rights. And I'm wondering whether such laws would have an effect on poverty and the likelihood that households would have access to, let's say, better users' rights or larger pieces of land that they can use, whether that have an impact on their probability of climbing out of poverty.
Thank you. I'm Rajul Pandya-Loach with IFPRI. It was a fascinating presentation. I have two questions. I apologize if Bob referenced them at the very beginning of his presentation I missed. Catherine, in one of your slides, you showed basically households that were never in poverty, once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. What is chronic poverty then? Is it that they're in poverty all the time? Or a magical 2, 3, whatever? Because then I wasn't quite sure compared to Bangladesh also. Second question I have is more for Bob. The studies in your book, are they all rural areas or do they cover urban areas? And if not, would you see any reason to invest in looking at this work in urban areas? Because as poverty sort of quote unquote migrates more from rural to urban areas, are you going to see similar patterns and similar policy? Well, obviously not agriculture related policy recommendations, but I'm curious about whether you'll see the dominance of health in those policy recommendations that come out for urban areas. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question about education of the household's heads. As far as I know, all the regressions did control for that. And in Bangladesh, we found that schooling is a very strong predictor of never being poor. It's a strong predictor of moving out of poverty, and it's a negatively associated with being chronically poor.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I didn't have time to go into too much detail, but basically we used 3 times out of 5 or average consumption below the poverty line if you average over the 5 periods. And we experimented with 3 and 4. There were only about 2.5% of people who were poor for the whole time, but we think that might also be because of measurement area. So yeah, it's not really a science. You have to make a few choices. But yeah, 3 out of 5 was our best attempt.
On the question about were they only rural studies, two of the panel studies in South Africa and Nepal did ask questions about urban areas, and they are included in some of the analysis. The Vietnam Household Living Standard Survey panel, which we used, also includes urban areas, but we didn't use that in the analysis because there are real problems with actually what kind of households are being picked up because of the household registration system there in urban areas. More generally, I would say that you do face different problems when you're trying to conduct panel surveys of urban households. You know, attrition is a real problem because urban households, particularly low income urban households, tend to move so much. So you do need slightly different strategies and slightly different survey methods to do a good job. Chan, apologies if it wasn't obvious that some of the remarks which I made on education, for example, education being associated with households moving out of poverty, or lack of education being associated with chronic poverty. Those were based on different types of regression analysis, both discrete and continuous, which were done in all of the 6 different country studies, and they would all have included different measures of, you know, education of a household head, best educated household member. So all of those things are there. Your question on land rights and what effect did these have on poverty? The redistributive land reforms which happened in Vietnam at the beginning of the Doi Moi period, together with before that, have had enormous impacts in terms of providing a broad asset base on which successful rural growth can happen. What the issue now is that land holdings are so small and so fragmented, and people are moving to the cities, that there needs to be actually more consolidation. And so some of these previous policies in terms of, you know, land use certificates and the land rights you have are now becoming outdated and starting to become restrictive.